So I finally finished Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward. And it's safe to say, in general, Heavensward is a major step up and improvement over A Realm Reborn. But for the purpose of this review, the section encompasses the epilogue of A Realm Reborn, which is the 7th Astral Era, and the main expansion of Heavensward up until credits roll. It does not include the Dragon Song post-epilogue, as that will happen in the next section of my review. So without further ado, let's get into it. The two biggest issues I had with Heavensward. The first and foremost issue comes in the epilogue of A Realm Reborn leading into Heavensward. And the reason for this is because that epilogue is over 100 quests long, some of which require you to repeat previous bosses on a harder difficulty, and the story within that section of the game is incredibly slow and a slog. Unfortunately, it is absolutely mandatory because you need to fill in the blanks before you reach Heavensward. One of the other issues pertaining to the story section of that is the fact that there is 3 mandatory raids in the form of the Crystal Tower side quest that must be completed. Why it's listed as a side quest and not the main quest is beyond me, but it is mandatory. That being said, though, the raids within that section were absolutely a blast to play. Playing with 24 players doing one raid is incredibly fun, minus one visual issue, which I will get to later on in the review. The other issue I had with Heavensward, without spoiling anything, comes in the form of the expansion's second last boss. And what I mean by this is the difficulty spike. Not necessarily the difficulty of the boss itself. The difficulty was challenging but fair, but it's the spike. Because this spike comes out of nowhere. Nowhere in the expansion does it build you up to this difficulty level. It's just you will casually play, have a good time. It's very relaxed, and then all of a sudden you get to this boss and it's a pain. And then you'll go into the final boss and it's a walk in the park for some reason. So that major jump for that one boss is the biggest issue I had from a gameplay perspective. But aside from these two issues, Heavensward is a major improvement. Everything from the art design, level design, characters, narrative, voice acting, all of this is a major step up. And the story itself, again without spoilers, really kicks it into high gear. So much so that it makes you look back at A Realm Reborn and man, it was a slog in comparison. Because the expansion is smaller in content in comparison to the base game, the story is far more focused and narrative driven, and there is far less filler. And without the less filler, it means that the pacing of the story is much better. The characters within the story are amazing. The twists are fantastic. Overall, from a narrative perspective, Heavensward was a blast to play. The dungeons and everything pertaining to them were also a blast to play, minus the one visual issue. Now, I was not aware about this visual issue until a colleague brought it to my attention, but it is highly recommended that you change your settings, that your party's visual clutter that is done in the battle settings is reduced to either off or limited. And the reason for this is because it wasn't an issue in the base game because most of the players you're playing at a lower level, so your access to your abilities and spells are limited, and therefore there's less visual clutter. But once you reach Heavensward and you're above the level of 50, you're approaching 60, and everybody has more access to their kits. When you have a full squad playing, there is a lot going on that's hard to keep up with, especially in a 24-player raid. There was times where I had no idea what was happening because of how much stuff was on screen. It was only after I discovered this setting that my colleague told me about, and I changed it, that the visual clutter was reduced to a point where the game became readable again. So this is something, it's a minor tweak, but it is something that I recommend that you do. Even if you're starting out at Realm Reborn, just do it right away so that you won't have this issue when you get to the later parts of the game and into the expansions where you have so much visual clutter that you don't know what's happening. But as for the the experiences themselves, they were absolutely fantastic. The boss battles, still great. It's a major step up, in fact, compared to A Realm Reborn, where A Realm Reborn was basic in the sense that you're fighting a boss, they cast the spell, it's on the ground, you move over, avoid the attack, rinse and repeat, and kill the boss. In Heavensward, they really, really, really do a good job of bringing in other mechanics into the game. A mechanic such as you have to use harpoons to pull the boss in. You have to move in within certain areas, use spells to protect certain things. It's all these other mechanics that were added into Heavensward that weren't necessarily present in the base game that really help the combat come through. And of course, because you are at a higher level, you gain more access to your kit. As a black mage myself, my kit gets more fleshed out, I get more spells, and it was, from a combat perspective, it's again better as you get more abilities and the mechanics are more well rounded off. But overall, I loved Heavensward, minus the difficulty, minus the slog. Now, some will argue, why did I include the epilogue of A Realm Reborn? It's because I'm basing my reviews strictly on when the credits roll, not when the section ends. So the credits rolled for A Realm Reborn before the 7th Astral Era, and the credits rolled in Heavensward before you get to the Dragon Song War. So that's how I'm basing it on. So the Dragon Song War will be part of the next review as opposed to this one. But aside from this, Heavensward was a fantastic expansion. I understand that it took 5 years to get from the base game to this expansion, and it shows. There's a lot of tender love and care put into this expansion, and it was a blast to play. Narratively, combat, art design, it was great. Players are very friendly, very helpful, so if you are new. The only other issue that came across was during the epilogue, the solo queue experience wasn't solo queue experience anymore. So I played the entirety of the base game solo, and then you get to the epilogue, and then you now have to do dungeons on a harder difficulty, which requires queuing with actual live players and not NPCs. When you go into Heavensward, it's very similar in that a lot of the dungeons, yes, you can perform them solo with NPCs, and there are some dungeons and some bosses where no, you can't do that. You have to queue with other players. So again, this is an MMO, so I understand the logic of not being able to play the entire game solo, but it's kind of like a false advertisement when Square's like, yeah, you can play the whole game solo, when no, you do have to go play with other players. And of course, playing with other players means that for those who have the experience, they just want to power through everything. And when it's your first time, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. So, whereas when you do it with NPCs, you can go at your leisurely pace and not be affected by other players and how they want to power through them. It is a minor gripe, but again, this is an MMO, not a single player experience. I just find it a little funny that Square Enix went through the merit of incorporating a lot of solo queue play only for certain parts to be mandatory multiplayer. So it is a little great, but it's nothing that I hold personally against it, but it's something to be aware of if you're trying to play the entire game solo, that there will be times where, yes, you must play with other players, both in the epilogue and the Heavensward expansion. I imagine this will be similar for the rest of the game going forward, but just keep that in mind. But overall, I enjoyed my time with Heavensward. I think the story was phenomenal. I think the characters are phenomenal. I think the art is phenomenal. I think the combat is really good. To me, the biggest gripe came in the form of the difficulty. It came in the form of the slog of an epilogue. But overall, this is a fantastic experience. I would give Heavensward an 8.5 out of 10. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.